Let me tell you about my Uncle Earl. Uncle Earl was my dad's older brother by 4 years, and they were wicked close when they were younger, growing up on the North Shore of Boston. My dad used to get pretty badly picked on by some Italian kids down at Bunker Hill High School, and Uncle Earl was the one who finally went down to talk to them about it. Yeah, he was that bigger brother. Another thing you should know about Uncle Earl. In the late 60s, the U.S. Marines were drafting all the poor Irish and Italian kids from the poorer neighborhoods around Beantown. According to my dad, everyone was terrified of getting that letter in their mailbox. But not Uncle Earl. Because of his 18th birthday, Uncle Earl marches down near Boston Common and signs up for boot camp. The way my dad tells it, this is because Uncle Earl was a quiet patriot who was honored to have the opportunity to serve his country. But we all know that the real reason is because Uncle Earl is completely nuts. So now for the actual story. It's late 1991. I've just turned 15 and Thanksgiving is just around the corner. Mom and Dad are rushing around trying to make sure everything is prepped and ready to go, while I'm just chilling in my room playing my brand new state-of-the-art Super Nintendo. Then an argument commences. My parents weren't really ones to argue out loud. They'd have tense but quiet discussions, trying not to let us kids see them being negative. I always appreciated that, but hence why I was so concerned about them shouting. I crack my bedroom door and listen in on what they're talking about, quickly gathering that it's an argument involving my Uncle Earl. Earl had decided to attend this year's Thanksgiving and was apparently bringing his family along with him. I didn't know too much about Earl, just that he was a NAM vet and that he and my dad hadn't spoken in almost 10 years. What my mom could have possibly found objectionable about this, I didn't know, but it did kind of make me sad that we seemed to have such a fractured family. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that Thanksgiving evening. And I would see exactly why my mom was so angry at my dad for refusing to disinvite Uncle Earl. Cut to Thanksgiving morning and things are tense in our house. All day, my mom is snipping at my dad, first seemingly hopeful that he'll disinvite his brother, but later outright contemptuous that he somehow didn't have the sack to tell him no. During a quiet moment, I asked Dad if Uncle Earl really was coming to dinner, and I'll never forget his reply. "Family should stick together, son, no matter what." He then told me the Italian bully story, and I remember understanding why he couldn't tell Earl no. They were brothers. Nothing could or would change that. So I'm back to wondering just what it is that's got my mom so on edge, letting the thoughts slip from my mind as I drive back in for another level of Super Mario World. But the cutesy 16-bit sound effects were suddenly drowned out by what sounded like an army of engines. Motorcycle engines, to be specific. I looked out of my bedroom window and gasped at what I saw. There's like a whole fleet of motorcycles clogging up our quiet suburban street. They're all wearing matching leather jackets too, with identical stitching and designs on the back of them. I squinted through the fogged glass, trying to read what they said. I had no frame of reference for them, so when I read the words Hell's Angels on the back of their jackets, it didn't really mean anything to me. But it would by the end of the evening.
"Where's that little brother of mine?"
An older man at the front of the column began to shout. His bare arms, how he wasn't freezing I don't know, were covered in hand-inked tattoos, one of which clearly read, "Vietnam Vet. When I die, I'll know I'll go to heaven, 'cause I served my time in hell." It was Uncle Earl. That was the evening the Massachusetts chapter of Hell's Angels Outlaw Motor Club invaded our family home. I think I was so scared at first because Mom locked herself in her bedroom. I'd never known her to be so skittish, and I guessed it was because these guys were actually dangerous. So you can imagine how terrified I was when I heard someone banging on my door. Before I could even answer, Uncle Earl and a handful of his Hell's Angel friends had piled in my room, the stench of cigarette smoke and open beer cans floating around the room.
"What is this?"
Uncle Earl spat, peering at the Super Nintendo and the graphics on the screen.
"Is this some kind of movie?"
I remember stammering, so scared I could hardly speak.
"Nah, Press.
one of his friends replied.
It's one of them video game things. Look, he's making it move with the remote thing there. My God, what a time to be alive,
Uncle Earl said with a smile.
You must be one wicked smart kid to be able to make it work, huh, kid?
He ruffled my hair, and I began to relax. But what he did next made my head spin.
Happy Thanksgiving, kid. Buy yourself a movie for your thing. I don't know what you call 'em.
Uncle Earl took out his wallet and tossed a few $10 bills onto the floor next to me.
Boys, back me up here.
At that, all of Uncle Earl's friends took a few dollar bills out of their pockets and tossed them onto the pile. I swear I had like $300 when I finally counted it all up. To this day, I've never seen such an outrageous display of generosity. But as they filed out of my bedroom, one of the bigger, hairier Hell's Angels didn't leave. He just sits down next to me on my bed and asks in the deepest, most gravelly voice I've ever heard.
Mind if I try?
I handed him the controller, and at first he couldn't work out how to do anything. He actually managed to walk down a pitfall too, thinking it was where he was supposed to go. I gave him a little impromptu Nintendo lesson until he actually got pretty good, and found myself kind of sad when he had to leave. When the angels had finally left, I plucked up the courage to see just what condition they'd left downstairs. It was a real mess, but it wasn't the whirlwind of destruction my mom dressed it up as. Just a lot of empty beer cans and fancy cups used as ashtrays. But there wasn't a single scrap of food left in our house. All the turkey, all the yams, every last mouthful of green bean casserole had all been completely consumed. That was the most terrifying thing in the end, really, that there wasn't even enough left over for a turkey sandwich. Thanksgiving, although one of the hallmark holidays in the American yearly calendar, can be an extremely stressful experience for some. For some unfortunate people, family is less about a network of love and support and more a web of jealousy, suspicion, and hatred. But for one Florida family, Thanksgiving joy turned to the ultimate horror, and it didn't end there. As Paul Marriage, 35 years old, commenced a murderous rampage directed at his own family members, he was reportedly heard to mutter, "I've been waiting nearly 20 years to do this." Marriage's violent mental break resulted in 4 dead and an additional 2 wounded on Thanksgiving 2009. Marriage's extended family had gathered at his cousin's house, owned by Muriel Sitton and her husband Jim, down in Jupiter, Florida. After chowing down on a traditional Thanksgiving meal, they'd gathered around a large grand piano and joined together in singing traditional Christmas songs, to the delight of a 6-year-old Michaela Sitton, who was tucked into bed soon after. It was as wholesome as a festive scene as one can possibly imagine, at least until Paul, who'd been acting relatively calmly all night, produced a loaded pistol and began fulfilling a dark, twisted fantasy he apparently had since he was a young boy. Marriage began systematically picking off his victims, shooting his 33-year-old twin sister Carla Marriage, who was employed as a real estate agent, and Lisa Knight, who was 8 months pregnant at the time of a brutal murder. Like little Michaela, they both loved to sing. Marriage also shot his 76-year-old aunt, Raymonda Joseph, who, due to her advanced age, had little to no chance of escaping the slaughter. Marriage's brother-in-law Patrick Knight was rushed to the hospital in critical but stable condition after surviving one of Paul's bullets. While another man, Clifford Gabera, 52, was grazed by a bullet and also taken to the hospital. Sitton doesn't think Marriage planned to kill Michaela, but he thinks he became overcome with rage and jealousy when he saw the family delight in her singing. "He tried to snuff out the light," Sitton said. "He came into a baby's room. He saw her innocence and he walked in and purposefully killed her." After the mass murder, Marriage went on the run from the law for weeks, supposedly having entertained ending his own life. He had been laying low in the Florida Keys under an assumed name and living off the $12,000 in cash he'd withdrawn before Thanksgiving. That was until January of 2010, when an attentive member of the public spotted him after his appearance on an episode of America's Most Wanted that focused on the obscene brutality of Marriage's killings. That huge 12 grand cash withdrawal further underlined how premeditated Marriage's crimes had been. The local Palm Beach Post described him as an estranged recluse who clashed with his sisters in the past. One had even taken out a restraining order against him a few years prior. But at that 2009 Thanksgiving, everything seemed calm, at least on the surface. However, court records show in the weeks before the deadly Thanksgiving attack, he had painstakingly and discreetly spent over $2,000 on at least 4 firearms and the appropriate ammunition in 2 Broward County gun shops. He even asked for a scope to be attached to a bolt-action Remington 700 rifle. He said he wanted to use it for hunting, but the gun salesman would have no idea just what he planned to hunt until weeks later. Marriage had been asking his parents probing questions for days about the Thanksgiving event, evidently trying to find out just who would be attending, but never committed to his own appearance until the day itself. This can be evidenced by the fact that his parents never alerted their hosts Jim and Muriel Sitton that he might be attending. When he called that evening to announce he was on his way, his mother couldn't resist a sinister thought. "I hope he doesn't come and kill us all tonight." Carol Marriage recalled telling her daughter, Lisa Knight, according to a Jupiter police report. "Mom, it came to my mind," her daughter replied. "But don't say that to Dad because he'll get upset that we even had such terrible ideas." In October of 2011, Marriage pled guilty to all charges after making a deal that would spare him the death penalty. Instead, he received 7 life terms to be served consecutively. As you might expect, the case caused a huge rift in the family, both emotionally and legally. Marriage's brother-in-law, Patrick Knight, who lost his wife and was himself gravely wounded in the shooting, said he was eager to move on from the tragedy instead of enduring years of appeals. But the murdered child's grieving father, Jim Sitton, begged the judge not to accept the dead in light of the slaying of their young daughter, Michaela, even falling to his knees in the courtroom. The Sittons also filed a lawsuit against Marriage's parents, seeking damages because they had invited him to the gathering without warning the host that their son might be dangerous. If someone brought a rattlesnake or a pit bull to your home without your permission, and that pit bull started attacking and killing people, wouldn't you hold that person responsible? Jimmy Sitton asked indignantly. "That's what this is. We're seeking justice with every means at our disposal." However, the aforementioned lawsuit was actually dismissed in late 2012, after it was determined the Marriages had no legal right or ability to control the actions of their son. But that wasn't the only suit filed in the wake of the brutal Thanksgiving murders. Patrick Knight also sued his former in-laws for failing to prevent the killings, including the death of their daughter and his wife, Lisa. Then, unbelievably, the Marriages filed a countersuit against the Sittons in 2011, alleging the Sittons were actually to blame for the bloodshed. To the extent Paul had problems, the entire family knew that, said the Marriages' attorney, Alan Rosen. If the Sittons were concerned he was going to be a problem that day, then they should have stopped them. It was their house. They should have protected their family as well as the Marriage family if they were concerned. In the lawsuit, the Marriages made counterclaims that Jim Sitton and his family had defamed them with unfair and untrue statements about the couple by saying they invited Paul to the dinner without notifying other members of the family and knowing his reputation for violence. Also named in the lawsuit is Dr. Antoine Joseph, whose wife was murdered by Marriage. Joseph is Muriel Sitton's father. His sister is Carol Marriage. Joseph had apparently treated Paul Marriage and therefore was well aware of his mental instability, as was the rest of the family, his parents contended. A tangled web, indeed. There was one tiny bright spot in all of this. During Marriage's trial, the Sittons announced that Muriel was pregnant with their second child. "We're having a girl, but it's very bittersweet. There will always be someone missing," Mrs. Sitton said. "Some wounds never really heal." My big sister has always been kind of the black sheep of the family. She got into partying way too young and got into all kinds of trouble with our parents and the police, and it was a general headache for our family right up until she left for college. She actually squared her stuff away in time for the SATs, or so Mom and Dad say, but only really mellowed slightly. She remained the mentally irregular weirdo that we'd all grown to know and love. So flashback to the second Thanksgiving since she moved to Jersey. First time, she just came home on her own. But the second time, she brought a friend. Her boyfriend, to be specific. Most doting moms will get pretty excited at the idea of meeting their daughter's college boyfriend, but like I said, my big sister was always different. So instead of wondering what handsome bookworm she was about to bring home, Mom and Dad started to profusely worry about what variety of freaks she'd drag over the threshold to spend an entire evening with us. Cut to the night in question. My mom gets a text from my sister saying she's on her way with the boyfriend. They're in his car, but they're stuck in a little Thanksgiving traffic and would be a little late. Mom and Dad's anxiety is at fever pitch at this point. They're rushing around, trying to make sure the house is perfect. Dad starts pounding beers. Mom starts whining at Dad for pounding said beers. The atmosphere is getting pretty intense. Then we hear car doors slamming outside. A girl's voice and a boy's voice coming up the driveway. I'd probably have been a little nervous if the whole thing wasn't so entertaining. Only when the boyfriend comes inside, it's a total anticlimax. He's clean-shaven, neat, actually kind of preppy, and shakes my parents' hands super politely before introducing himself. Now, just to explain, I'm not using any names here, and you'll soon realize why that's the case since there's so much personal info on my account. So it's actually looking like my parents have got themselves all worked up over nothing, like I mentioned. My sister had done a fair bit of mellowing out in the run-up to her SATs, so I guess it made sense that it carried on into college. So the boyfriend starts with this impressing the parents routine, and honestly worked like a charm. He was studying environmental science or something as his major. I can't remember exactly what his degree was, but my parents were seriously impressed. But when he announced he'd brought some home-cooked food to add to the spread, they seemed to fall for him harder than my sister had. And I don't know. I get it. He seemed pretty cool. He played Xbox too, so even we had something to talk about for a while. So eventually my mom wanders off into the kitchen to take various things out of various ovens, and before long she announces that dinner is ready. Quick note, the casserole dish full of stew that my sister and her boyfriend had brought was covered in aluminum foil and been placed in an oven to keep warm, so it ended up on the table, lost in the jumble with everything else, all the yams, pots of cranberry sauce, etc. So when it came time to passing around plates, everyone got a little spoonful of this mystery stew. My dad says grace before we all tuck in. Not that he's religious, but he's big on tradition and the actual giving thanks part of the Thanksgiving experience. I like to think he's not talking to God, just whatever force in the universe made it so we could be fortunate enough to enjoy this kind of abundance. And then, as you can expect, everyone starts devouring their food, as we've been pretty much fasting all day since the kitchen was well and truly occupied. But when my dad gets done with his little Thanksgiving speech, my sister's boyfriend asks if he can say a few words. Everyone is busy filling their mouths, so there's a few affirmatory grunts and nods before he begins his little speech. So I can't remember what he said word for word, but I can definitely remember the spirit of what was said. So here goes. A big part of the Thanksgiving tradition is acknowledging the influence of our Native American brothers and sisters on our great American culture. It was some grandiose opening. I think I was barely listening at that point. We can still learn a lot from the once plentiful tribes that once called these lands home, and one of the most important lessons is respect for the animals that help maintain our lifestyles. Right about then, I cut into a chunk of meat that had been spooned on my plate for their mystery stew and instantly recoil. The thing was kind of hollow on the inside, not like any piece of braised beef or lamb I'd ever come across. It took me a minute, but something just kind of clicked when I took a closer look. I recognized something about it. something from biology class the year before. It was an empty chamber, what was technically known as a ventricle. What I was looking at, what I'd just about to take a bite out of, was a lamb's heart. Right as I'm wide-eyed looking up, about to draw attention to just what was on my plate, I hear my mom gag audibly. She recoils from the table, pushing her chair away so hard it made this horrible, squeaky, creaky sound against the hardwood floor. There, sitting in the middle of her plate for all to see, was an eyeball. Little side note, my mom loves animals. Not quite in the same way that the boyfriend obviously did. More in a, I wanted to be a vet and I almost went vegan kind of way. And she is horrified, beyond horrified, like this is an actual nightmare come to life for her. She gets up, sprints over to the downstairs bathroom and slams the door behind her before we hear puking and retching noises from behind the locked door. So my dad chases this guy out of the house, with my sister screaming at them both, trying to stop a full-on murder from occurring right in our driveway. I watch for a bit, then grab some turkey for a sandwich before heading up to my room to tell my friends exactly how this entire crazy drama unfolded. But this wasn't the end of the whole drama, not by a long shot. Word comes through the family grapevine that my sister was so mad by what he did that she broke off the relationship. Apparently the guy didn't take it very well. But if he couldn't handle a simple Thanksgiving dinner, how was he going to handle getting dumped? So my sister comes home again for Christmas break, alone this time, and we're not expecting anything weird to happen, like at all. Which only made it all the worse when Mom went to take the dogs for a walk one morning and found something hanging in the tree. It was a lamb, hanging by its hind legs, its stomach torn open, with its guts still streaming in the cold winter air. Thanksgiving is a time of year when families convene to show their appreciation for life's blessings. It should be a time of safety and sanctuary, when the worries and concerns of everyday living are put aside for an evening of festive feasting. But for one man in Minnesota, Thanksgiving of 2012 would become a turning point, an event that would separate everything that came before from everything that came after. This is the story of the true nightmare on Elm Street. Byron David Smith lived alone on Elm Street in Little Falls, Minnesota. He was a retiree, having worked for the U.S. State Department for many years as a security engineering officer. But Smith's retirement was not a quiet one. His home had been burglarized at least half a dozen times over the few months leading up to Thanksgiving of 2012. He had only reported one of the previous burglaries to police, and investigators only found evidence of 2 previous burglaries, one of which occurred in his detached garage, and of which he appeared to have no knowledge when it was brought up by police. Among the items stolen were $4,000 in cash, his father's POW watch, coins from a collection, and a chainsaw. Smith installed a security system to protect himself. He also began routinely wearing a hip holster with a loaded gun inside his home, as well as stashing bottles of water and granola bars in his basement. It may seem like Byron Smith was being overly paranoid. Installing a home security system is one thing, but stocking up on rations like some kind of survivalist may have been a step too far. But Smith was right to be paranoid. Every evening in the run-up to Thanksgiving, his home was being cased. Casing is when a potential burglar simply observes a potential target for an extended period of time. This is to establish the homeowner's daily routines, to work out the best points of entry and escape, as well as to analyze if there are any valuables in the target home. The 2 predators outside of Smith's home was Haley Kiefer, 18, and her cousin, Nicholas Brady, 17. There is plenty of evidence that the pair was responsible for the previous burglaries at Smith's home. Brady was being investigated for prior burglaries, one of which was committed that very same Thanksgiving day. Brady was also under investigation for theft of drugs from his sister's home, so it's easy to make the assumption that Brady and Kiefer were committing a crime to fund some kind of narcotics habit. On the afternoon of Thanksgiving Day 2012, Byron Smith was making a friendly visit to his neighbors to wish them a happy holiday. As he was concluding his visit and was making his way back home, Smith saw Kiefer and Brady driving in the direction of his home. The pair must have had somewhat of a reputation in Little Falls because Smith suspected them of being at least partially responsible for some of the break-ins at his home. Smith then commented that he needed to get ready for her and went back to his house. Upon arriving home, Smith switched on a recording device he owned. He then removed the light bulbs from the ceiling lights in his basement and positioned himself in a chair that was obscured from view. He wasn't just looking to catch the pair in the act. Byron Smith had set up a sophisticated ambush inside his own home. Shortly after, he heard an upstairs window break before one of the pair climbed through the opening and into the home. Smith then waited in silence for 12 whole minutes, not making a sound, not moving a muscle. He had made a point of moving all the valuables in home into the basement in the hopes of luring any potential burglars into his ambush. It worked like a charm. When Brady began to descend into the basement, Byron Smith shot the teenage drug addict twice on the stairs with a silenced firearm, and once in the head after he fell to the bottom of the stairs. Elated and overcome with bloodlust, Smith made taunting remarks to Brady's still warm corpse, wrapped it in a tarp, and dragged him into another room. Smith then rushed to reload his weapon and re-establish his ambush, taking up his previous position in the obscure chair. Minutes later, Kiefer entered the home and could be heard calling her cousin's name. Their usual burglaries were normally quick and efficient, but Brady had been gone around 15 to 20 minutes. His cousin was undoubtedly deeply concerned. When she made her way down the stairs, Byron Smith put a bullet in her, just as he had her cousin. Mortally wounded, her body crumpled in pain and shock. She tumbled down the basement stairs and slammed into the cold concrete floor. In the audio recording that Smith made of the ambush, Kiefer can clearly be heard screaming, "I'm sorry. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I don't want to die." Smith simply got up, approached her wounded body as she tried desperately to crawl back up the stairs, and shot her again through the left eye in a callous, cold-blooded execution. Then, just as he had with her cousin, he spat bile-filled words at her, then dragged her into the other room before tossing her body on top of her cousin's. Despite having the corpses of the two teenagers in his basement, Smith was in no rush to report the incident to local police. When later asked why he delayed reporting the crime, Smith replied that he didn't want to bother the cops on Thanksgiving. Police acknowledged that Kiefer and Brady were definitely there to rob Smith's house, but asked why Smith felt the need to employ such lethal force against unarmed thieves. In his statement, Smith said that Kiefer had let out a short laugh after she fell down the stairs, saying, "If you're trying to shoot somebody and they laugh at you, you go again." The audio tape did not record Kiefer laughing. Instead, she cries out, "Oh God," in fear. In police interviews, Smith acknowledged firing more shots than I needed to, and that he fired a good, clean finishing shot into Kiefer's head. On April the 29th, 2014, a jury of his peers found Byron David Smith guilty as charged on 2 counts of first-degree murder with premeditation, with an additional 2 counts of second-degree murder. The jury took just 3 hours to deliberate. A judge then sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The audio recordings were named by the jurors as the biggest influence on their decision. "That was the most concrete piece of evidence in my mind," said juror Wes Hattelstad following the trial. The audio recording of the actual killings and the audio recording of Mr. Smith's interview immediately after his arrest pretty much convinced me that we were dealing with a deranged individual. I had just arrived at a nearby grocery store on Thanksgiving afternoon. You know how it is. You think you've got all your bases covered until it's half an hour before the relatives are due to arrive, and you realize you've gone and forgotten to pick up cranberry sauce. Or you only have 1 bottle of wine to be shared among like 10 to 12 people. I mean, no offense to my in-laws, but I'm not dealing with a dozen of them at a time without at least 2 or 3 glasses of Merlot in my belly. They call it a social lubricant for a reason, right? Anyway, everything seemed perfectly normal as I got out of my Chevy and started walking over to the storefront. However, by the time I reached the end of the parking lot and was only within a few meters of the store, I spotted them. There were like 10 really obvious gang members standing in front of the store's entrance. They all looked young, but they definitely had the attire of a fairly large gang in the nearby area. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Check this boomer thinking any gatherings of youth is like a gang, or some nonsense. But here's the thing. We're the only township in our state to have our own gang unit, as we have some serious problems with gang activity bleeding over from a nearby metropolis. I actually have an old high school buddy who was attached to said gang unit for a few months of tactical training. So trust me when I say I recognized a few different indicators that these guys were definitely in a gang. Color coding, similar tattoos. They even wore Boston Red Sox or Chicago Bears caps, anything with the telltale B on it. As I approach them, I am constantly repeating to myself in my head, don't make eye contact, keep cool, don't make eye contact, don't make yourself a target. I must have repeated that a dozen times, but honestly, it didn't make me feel any calmer whatsoever. It also didn't help any. As I'm getting towards the storefront, I can see one of the gang members break away from his group and make an approach to me. I literally have hundreds of dollars on me at this point after having made almost constant trips to various grocery and liquor stores over the previous few days. All that, and we still didn't have enough for our guests. Typical. Luckily, as one of the gang starts to approach me, a lady hastily walked towards the store and caught its attention, along with the other members. They promptly switched targets, and I breathed a huge sigh of relief. The gang members started to initiate a conversation with the lady, something that was obviously confrontational. As they talked about something, I didn't really listen, I just wanted to quickly go past them. I sped up to go into the store, barely escaping their grasp. Once I finished my shopping, the hard part came, going back to my car while my arms are fully laden with grocery bags that are quite obviously filled with bottles of booze. A prime target for robbery if ever there was one. I planned ahead and only brought things I could carry in the plastic bags. The cart was too big of a risk. Regrettably, I brought 1 or 2 more things than what I could comfortably handle, so as I started to approach the exit, I could feel something about to fall out of the bag. I go through the automatic doors and accidentally make eye contact with one of them. I quickly look away, and in my head I'm cursing at myself for making such a foolish mistake, but it's way too late. The gang member that I made eye contact with started to approach me and starts muttering something that I figured is directed at me, but I just ignored it and rapidly walked to my car. However, no matter how fast I walk, it's no use. The kid quickens his walking pace along with me, power walking towards me as he's still saying something. I speed up even more, and then I hear a few things fall out of one of my bags. For a split second, I contemplate on what to do. Ultimately, I decided as a lost cause and continue my fast walk toward my car. The boy is still on my tail. I finally reach my car, but with my hands full, I cannot reach into my pockets for the car keys. I quickly drop the groceries from one of my hands to get the keys, but I realize in absolute horror that I've somehow dropped both my keys and my wallet. I have no idea why I opted to do that, throw my wallet and keys inside the grocery bags along with the bottles. In retrospect, I figured that it was just a rush decision, one made in panic and haste, and ultimately a poor one. I was effectively trapped in this parking lot with the approaching member quickly gaining on me. I look to my right and see the boy standing there with a smirk on his face, holding what is clearly my wallet and keys in his hand. I'm terrified inside and thinking the worst, that he's about to take my car off of me, as well as my keys and my wallet. I was just imagining how angry my wife would be. It was at least 2 hours walking back to our family home, and that's if weather holds. If not, I might be in some serious hypothermic trouble, facing a fate considerably worse than just a dressing down from a furious spouse. Then, to my surprise, he comes closer to me. He's just off my left shoulder, and I'm actually considering something life-changing. You see, in my glove compartment is a .38 snub nose that I kept for self-defense purposes. In a split second, I could see myself in my imagination smashing the car window, whipping the glove compartment open, grabbing that pistol, and shooting that kid dead. But just when I think he's about to pull his own gun, or a knife or something, I just hear him say, "Hey mister, I think you dropped this." He's holding out my keys and wallet, obviously offering them back to me in a peaceful display of thoughtfulness. Astounded, feeling somewhat ashamed for my assumptions, I hesitantly say, "Thanks." Thinking that there was nothing to fear, I grab the item and start putting my groceries away. Looking back, I think the only scary thing was how quickly I judged those kids. I mean, I know they were in a gang, but that doesn't mean that even bad people aren't capable of acts of compassion and kindness, especially on a day like Thanksgiving. These days, the majority of students in American public schools grow up learning the story of how the English Pilgrims and Native Americans came together for the first Thanksgiving in Plymouth. Yet the reality of the situation is that there was no lasting peace between the English settlers and their one-time Native American allies. Shortly after the Plymouth meeting, the two groups became entangled in a devastating series of conflicts just a single generation after the famous feast. As it turns out, the true story behind Thanksgiving is a bloody struggle that decimated the population and ended with a bloody, severed head impaled on a stick. It is generally thought that Thanksgiving is a time for family reunions, festive parades, mountains of delicious fall foods, not to mention the rush for college students and transplants alike to make it home in time to carve the turkey. American school children are usually taught that tradition dates back to the arrival of the Pilgrims on the ship christened the Mayflower. These were English members of small religious sects, persecuted in their homeland, who helped to establish the Plymouth colony of present-day Massachusetts in the year 1620. According to legend, friendly local Native Americans from the Wampanoag tribe contacted the Pilgrims in order to teach the struggling colonists how to survive in their new wild home. Then everyone got together to celebrate with a feast in 1621. Attendees included almost 100 warriors from Wampanoag tribe and the 50 or so surviving Mayflower passengers. The celebrations lasted 3 whole days and featured a menu including deer, fowl, and freshly baked corn on the cob. In reality, Thanksgiving feasts predate the Plymouth colony by many years. In fact, upon investigation, one finds a number of different places have tried to claim that they were the first to hold Thanksgiving celebrations. According to local researchers, settlers in the Berkeley Hundred of Virginia, a hundred is an archaic administrative division that is geographically part of a larger region, decided to celebrate their arrival with an annual Thanksgiving back in 1619. Although the Washingtonian, a magazine in circulation around the District of Columbia, reported the meal was probably nothing more than some shucked oysters and baked ham thrown together for the occasion. Additionally, decades before that, Spanish settlers and members of the Saloy tribe in Florida broke bread with salted pork, garbanzo beans, and a Catholic Mass, way back in 1565. The contemporary idea of Thanksgiving dinner revolves around eating roasted turkey, but to the Pilgrims, the festival was more of an occasion for Orthodox religious observance. The oft-told tales of the 1621 Plymouth festivities live on in popular memory, but the Pilgrims themselves would have likely considered their sober 1623 day of prayer the first true Thanksgiving. But disturbingly enough, others pinpoint the year 1637 as the true origin of Thanksgiving, owing to the fact that Massachusetts colony governor John Winthrop declared a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate colonial soldiers who had just slaughtered several hundred Pequot tribesmen, women, and children at a site where Mystic, Connecticut is now located. Either way, the popular telling of the initial harvest festival is what lived on, thanks to the speech writing and storytelling of one Abraham Lincoln. The enduring national holiday had also nearly erased from our collective memory what happened between the Wampanoag tribe and English settlers, little over a generation later. Massasoit, the sachem or top chieftain of the Wampanoag, proved to be an important ally and friend to the English settlers in the years following the establishment of Plymouth Colony. He set up an exclusive trade pact with the newcomers and allied with them against the French and other local tribes like the Narragansetts. But the alliance became severely strained as the years went by. Tens of thousands of English colonists poured into the region throughout the 17th century. According to certain history books, authorities in Plymouth began asserting direct control over most aspects of Wampanoag life. As settlers increasingly ate up more land, some have estimated that diseases such as smallpox had already reduced the Native American population in New England by as much as 90% from 1616 to 1619, and indigenous people continued to die from what the colonists called Indian fever. By the time Massasoit's son, Metacomet, who, known to the English as King Philip, inherited leadership of the tribe, relations had frayed to the point of complete disrepair. What's known as King Philip's War was sparked off when several of Metacomet's men were executed for the murder of a Ponkapoag interpreter and a Christian convert who went by the new name of John Sassamon. Brave Wampanoag warriors responded with a series of violent raids on English settlements, and the New England Confederation of Colonies rallied to declare war in 1675. Even the initially neutral colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations were ultimately dragged into the fighting, as were other nearby tribes like the Narragansetts. The war was bloody and devastating. Springfield, Massachusetts was burned to the ground during a raid, and the Wampanoag abducted colonists to ransom back to settlers. English forces attacked the Narragansetts on a bitter frozen swamp for harboring fleeing Wampanoag. 600 Narragansetts were killed, and the tribe's winter stores were ruined. Colonists in far-flung settlements relocated to more fortified areas while the Wampanoag and allied tribes were forced to flee their villages. The colonists ultimately allied with several tribes like the Mohegans and Pequots, despite initial reluctance from the Plymouth leadership. Meanwhile, Metacomet was dealt a staggering blow when he crossed over into New York to recruit allies. Instead, he was rebuffed and attacked by Mohawks. Upon his return to his ancestral home at Mount Hope, he was shot and killed in a final battle. The son of the man who had sustained and celebrated with the Plymouth colony was then beheaded and dismembered. His remaining allies were killed and sold into slavery in the West Indies. The colonists impaled King Philip's head on a spike and displayed it in Plymouth for 25 years. The war's ultimate death toll could have been as high as 30% of the entire English population and over half of the Native Americans in the New England area. The war was just one of a series of brutal but dimly remembered early colonial wars between Native Americans and colonists that occurred in New England, New York, and Virginia. Popular memory has largely clung to the innocuous image of a harvest celebration, while ignoring the deadly forces that would ultimately drive apart the descendants of the guests of that very feast. Modern-day Thanksgiving may be a celebration of people coming together, but that's not the whole story when it comes to the history of that day. It's Thanksgiving Day in 1980. Ronald Reagan was elected president weeks prior. There are still 54 American hostages held in the Iranian capital, Tehran. In Reno, Nevada, the biggest little city in the world, locals are preparing to celebrate a long-standing American tradition. It's 2:57, around 47 degrees, a warm Thursday afternoon for November. 30 years prior to present, Reno is a different town. Fewer towering buildings decorate the skyline. The slate crosswalks downtown aren't yet conceived, nor are the purple flower boxes and trash cans that will give Virginia Street an effervescent character. A time traveler would likely hear the sounds of Kenny Rogers' Saccharine Lady or Blondie's Call Me from a passing car stereo. Competing with street sounds are the mechanical jingling, clinking, and ringing of casino slot machines. The noises are from the actual sound of metal striking metal, not the polyphonic electronic beeps that they have today. The scent of local restaurants' Thanksgiving specials, roast turkey or baked ham wafts through the air. Those planning ahead with Christmas shopping are more likely to come downtown or to Park Lane Mall than the JCPenney at Meadowwood Mall, which has yet to become the area's shopping mecca. This means that the downtown area is absolutely teeming with shoppers, picking up last-minute gifts and food items before convening with their families for an evening of feasting and revelry. But joining them is 51-year-old Priscilla Joyce Ford, an African-American teacher and mother of 3. It would be easy to assume that a woman with 3 young children would have driven downtown that day to pick up yams, cranberry sauce, or any other last-minute foods that constitute a stable Thanksgiving spread. But Priscilla Ford is there for a different reason entirely. Ford is driving a blue 1974 Lincoln Continental, a vehicle that weighs over 5,000 pounds, with a top speed of over 120 miles per hour. One might believe that a teacher and mother of 3 might have something of an angelic past, but not Priscilla Ford. 23 years prior to that Thanksgiving day, Ford shot her second husband with a .38 revolver before threatening to turn the gun on herself. She was also arrested for trespassing and assault after tracking down one of her ex-husbands in a fit of rage. Ford is 5'4" and weighs 125 pounds. She has brown eyes and shoulder-length hair combed back. She has crackers and emerald dry wine before leaving on an errand. Her blood alcohol ratio is .162. That's too drunk to be driving legally, but many a barfly has made it home with hire. Sitting peacefully in her car, Priscilla Ford notices that there are many more people than usual walking up and down the downtown sidewalks. People are milling along Casino Row. Perhaps because of the mild weather, there are more tourists than usual here during the tail end of a national recession. It takes another minute for the Lincoln to make its way to 100 feet south of the southeast corner of 2nd and Virginia Streets. At 2:59 p.m., the Lincoln jumps the curb and careens down the sidewalk. It hits the curb at about 20 miles an hour so as not to blow the tires, but the vehicle rapidly accelerates to as high as 40 miles per hour, driving another 100 feet down the sidewalk, witnesses will later say. It crosses the 2nd Street crosswalk and continues another 322 feet down the sidewalk in front of the bank, in front of Harrah's, Nevada Club, and Harold's Club. Then it's back on Virginia Street, crossing to the southbound lane and stopping 2 blocks later behind traffic at the 5th Street traffic light. The light is red. Bodies fly left and right. The screams are blood-curdling. Destruction follows the car's path like a tornado. 5 people are killed immediately and 24 are injured. 14 people will be sent to Washoe Medical Center, the remaining 10 to St. Mary's. Street signs, body parts, clothing, wounded, and dead lie on the sidewalk and in the gutter like victims of a natural disaster. But this is an entirely unnatural disaster. It takes only a few seconds for Ford to drive 5 whole blocks. For the victims, every second following the attack is an eternity, waiting for help to arrive, for family members to come, for the news of survivors and casualties. But the longest wait, some will later say, is for justice. John Oakes is the deputy district attorney on call that day. "I was dispatched down to a hit and run," he says. "I thought they were kidding me. It's Thanksgiving. I got downtown and it was a war zone. I never saw nothing like that before in my life. There were bodies everywhere. It was pure carnage. People were crying over the bodies of the dead. Ambulances were responding, but there just weren't enough of them. It was a complete mess." Later, John Oakes is told to keep an eye on Priscilla Ford. There was a trauma center set up down at Washoe Med, and we had the victims coming in crying and screaming, family members filing in, all of them just shell-shocked. The perp was right next door. An officer and I were directed to maintain security because a lot of people wanted to just end her right there. Oakes spends around 5 hours in the company of the killer. He says the most remarkable thing about her was her calmness, mixed with callousness. At one point, she looked at me point blank and asked, "How many people did I kill?" I said, 5 or 6. She said, "Good." She was just cold to it all, like it was just another day to her. Very matter of fact. Very matronly, motherly. She was acting self-righteous, like she was justified in what she did. We couldn't figure out why at the time. What's the first defense of anybody who creates this kind of carnage? Only a crazy person would do something like that. I got down to Reno PD before she was brought into booking, and I had them set up the video, so we could see on tape exactly how lucid she was. She knew who she was and where she was. That tape was well worth its weight in gold. On August 4th, 1981, Priscilla Ford was successfully found competent to stand trial after previously being found incompetent on January 29th. The trial lasted almost 5 months. After 13 hours of deliberation, a jury composed of 7 women and 5 men found Ford guilty on 6 counts of murder and a whopping 23 counts of attempted murder on March 19, 1982. A few weeks later, the jury decided she was to be put to death. Even though 7 people died as a result of Ford's attack, issues in the indictment caused Ford to only be charged with 6. Ford's lawyer claimed she was mentally ill with schizophrenia and should not be put to death, rather spend the rest of her life in a mental institution. However, the district attorney called her evil personified and fought for Ford to be found legally sane. Ford herself went on to stand and testify that she believed she was the reincarnation of Jesus and therefore incapable of sin. But it seems the only thing Priscilla Ford was incapable of was compassion for her victims. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't let the turkey tame you this Thanksgiving. Be safe. Be smart.